Nicole Foster is the Director of Global AI, ML, and Canada Public Policy for Amazon Web Services. She is joined on stage by the Messenger's AI business reporter, Jackie Snow, for a conversation on balancing the speed of innovation with the need for AI regulation.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Nicole, for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
I want to start with just hearing about right now how you think about balancing innovation with the need for regulation, where we find ourselves with AI today.
So, I mean, we certainly are not an unregulated industry, despite some of the discussion today. There is actually a lot of legislation or regulation that already does apply to a lot of the use cases where we see AI being deployed. So it's not entirely unregulated, although the discussions thus far would make you think so. And then in terms of innovation, I think there are lots of opportunities to regulate in a way that both protects the public and still allows for innovation to flourish.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk about some of that regulation that you think can guide us right now that's already on the books?
Sure. So, well, I mean, whether it applies to healthcare or financial services, there are lots of existing legislation that organizations have to adapt to, whether or not it's a computer making the decision or a human making a decision. So those same rules and regulations still apply regardless of the technology in use. So those are still relevant. In other jurisdictions, there's, for example, strong privacy legislation that still applies, or biometric legislation that applies. So there is a lot of legislation that we have to comply to as we develop or deploy AI in different use cases.
Okay, so maybe some of this misperception about lack of regulation is because, and I come across this in my reporting, where we treat AI as if it's like a completely separate thing, almost like not even a technology. It's like a separate sphere of something we've created, but in reality, maybe it does sort of fit into some frameworks that we've already created.
Yeah, so I think the other way we sort of think about it, I mean, for AWS anyway, we've worked with companies or organizations in every sector of the economy and everywhere all over the world. And so when you realize just sort of the depth and breadth of this technology, it is very hard to regulate it kind of with one brush. And so before we even get to regulation, when we think about how we deploy responsibly, it is very use case specific. So the questions that you need to ask or risks that you need to manage are often very specific to your use case. And sometimes there are actually very, very low risk use cases where you probably don't need to regulate at all. So the challenge for legislators is to really kind of determine where these sort of things fall in the threshold of risk and make sure that we are focused on the areas where there is high risk and that we're paying attention to those areas. And I think if you want to be in an environment where innovation still flourishes, you maybe want to have a lighter touch in the areas where there's much less risk.
Okay, and so even granted that there is maybe like a whole host of different types of risk for the use case, maybe overall, do you have thoughts about the concerns that some people are talking about when it comes to moving too quickly with this technology?
Well, moving too quickly, I think it's going at a pace that it is going. And I think it is truly a challenge to sort of adapt existing legislation, but also to come up with new legislation in a timely way. So obviously, there's a lot of discussion of the EU AI Act, and that's an example where they've been really developing this very comprehensive piece of legislation over a large number of years, and they've done, I think, some very, very good work in terms of their analysis. But 3 years in, we also had the sort of advent of large language models, and they're now trying to, at the very 11th hour, adapt the technology, or adapt the legislation to incorporate this new technology. So I think from a policy standpoint, we need to think about frameworks that can remain flexible to adapt to those things. So as an example, rather than creating a really strong rules-based system, some of the work being done in international standards organizations, or even NIST here in the US, I think are some good examples to follow. So looking at governance practices and how we are managing risk and aligning ourselves to those standards to make sure that we're asking the right questions, I think is a great way to start. If you're trying to kind of create rules that are very strict and regimented, it's going to be very hard to adapt that to new technology as it emerges. And it could have the impact of either stifling innovation, or it could have the impact of completely regulating the wrong thing.
Speaking of some of these new large language models, you guys just announced Q, which is building off some of the large language models from, I think it's Anthropic, and that's the one coming to mind right now. But can you talk to me about what frameworks you guys were thinking about when launching this new AI tool?
So the AWS approach around large language models has really been about offering a lot of different choices in terms of different models. And what we've seen is that some models perform really well in certain use cases and less well in other use cases. So we have a service called Bedrock, which is sort of basically a menu option of being able to opt and try different models for your use case and adapt them to your business needs or your organizational needs. So our approach has really been about giving more choices of different types of models to our customers.
Okay. So I read in, let me get my notes right here. Platformer reported that Q is experiencing severe hallucinations and leaking confidential data. You are by no means the first company to deal with this, and you probably won't be the last. So I wonder if you can speak to how regulation maybe could impact large language models and some of these issues we see with them going forward.
Well, I think it is around testing your use case. So, and this falls into some of the risk management frameworks that already exist. So once you have deployed once you've sort of decided what your approach you're going to take or what technology you're going to use and how it applies to your business, you're going to want to test and audit that over time to make sure you're not, and there's a myriad of different things that you want to test for. So you want to test for drift, you want to test to ensure that the guardrails that you implemented are actually working, that the model is performing accurately for what you want it to do, and of course mitigate any potential harm that may arise from it.
Okay, and do you have any insight into, I know these are very early days, I think it was 3 days after it was launched that this came to light. Do you have any insight into where maybe the internal work that you guys did didn't catch these particular issues?
I'm not super familiar with that exact thing, but I mean, essentially what always happens is there's lots of internal kind of testing and experimentation, and then escalations that happen as a result of errors that take place. So that's why you'll see a lot of organizations sort of release things in a very sort of protected beta options. So they release things in preview for customers to try and work with their use case to see how it's going to perform, and then there's usually a series of improvements that need to take place as part of that experimentation, and then before anything is launched for general availability. That's generally the process, but there's always lots of nits along the way.
Sure. We have a couple minutes left. I have another question I'm going to ask, but if anyone has some questions, just think about it, and we have people with mics that can come to you. But I did want to ask one last thing. We have lawmakers here with us today, and I wanted to know, what would you like to see from Congress specifically in terms of regulation in the next year or so?
I think my two sort of recommendations are, three. First, make sure it's not already legislated. Second would be to take a risk-based approach to legislation so that we are really targeting the deployments that are most concerning and have the highest risk for the population. And then the third would be to make sure that that the regulatory frameworks that are developed here are interoperable around the world. So this is a technology that is a global technology, and we essentially kind of need to create norms that are going to be globally sustainable and interoperable around the world.
Great. Does anyone have any questions for Nicole? All right, I think we have mics.
Thank you. Just wanted to collect your thoughts. Would it make sense to have a self-regulation organization, so among the providers of this technology?
What it makes sense to have a what?
Self-regulatory organizations, such as FINRA for the security services.
Essential, yes, so it could. So there's a couple of different, the EU has taken a very centralized approach to how it's regulating AI. And I think there's also a need to kind of think about very specific sectors where there's already strong amounts of regulation. So whether it's financial services or healthcare, it's probably more beneficial for a healthcare regulator to gain some knowledge around applications of AI in that sector, rather than trying to make an AI regulator an expert on healthcare. But at the end of that, you're probably going to want to have some sort of a backstop legislation to ensure that there are aspects of this that don't kind of fall through the cracks. And that backstop legislation should really sort of have the principles around managing risk and what are the approaches that we take to managing risk, as well as then testing and auditing.
Great. Well, that's all the time we had. Thank you so much, Nicole. I really appreciate you taking time to talk with
Thanks
us all
for
today.
having me.